This is a very short video, Rover K series head gaskets. I've got a Rover Coupe 1.6 and I've just had this changed, but I just thought I'd do this video because there's a lot of, I guess, some misinformation, but there's a lot of scare stories about owning a K series Rover engine, and really the problem just comes down to this component, to be honest. Yes, okay, you do have to look at other things on the cooling system, make sure there's no leaks, but that's just like any other car really. The main issue is with this type of gasket, and I'll explain why. You may or may not disagree, but this is my opinion. These were introduced, this type of gasket was introduced on the original K series, which was 1100 and 1400. Back in, I think it was about 1989, and this was quite a revolutionary engine because it used a through bolt system, so you can see the bolts went straight through by the cylinder walls, and you know, this type of gasket design came out of basically trying to make that engine work really with a long bolt system. I think it was one of the first, if not the first, type of engine on a mass-produced car that had that type of system. So this was the design. Now, on those early engines, the 1100s, 1400s, from what I remember at the time, because we did have a few early 200s at the time in the family, and you know, a few friends had that as well. I don't recall them being a big issue with head gasket failure. And I think that was because it was a lower capacity engine. There was more cooling capacity in there, in the block, and there was also some other things on the early cars which were quite advantageous, such as aluminium inlet manifolds, which were reliable. That was later changed to plastic, and there was an issue with the gaskets on them. It's a £5 part, but sometimes that was misdiagnosed as a head gasket. But anyway, cutting a long story short, I think the lower capacity cars early on were reasonably okay. Yeah, they kind of went eventually, these gaskets, the head gasket, but it was tended to be at a higher mileage, probably similar to, you know, Honda engines which were in the Triumph Acclaim and the earlier Rover. I think it was the SD3 or something it was called, the kind of square looking one. So it was kind of, you know, within the limits of that. So you're talking about 80,000 miles maybe, and it'll go. But they seemed to get worse as production went along. There was a few changes made. I mentioned the inlet manifolds design changed, and the capacities of the engines changed, and they went from what I believe was a wet liner system to a damp liner system, with increased capacity engines, more power, I guess more stress on the engine, and there seemed to be a lot more failures. So that kind of brought this issue to light, and really it didn't do Rover much good. But the engine essentially was a good engine. It was just this damn design wasn't really good enough anymore for the high capacity engines. So I'll just show you what really is the problem. Now, this is a sheet of aluminium with an elastomer bead, and this is, I think this is kind of printed on or melted on, I'm not quite sure. And what seems to happen over time is, you can see on here is, you can see where it's went black around, particularly around these kind of church window type areas. I've peeled one off there, and it just weakens the bond. You know, as you can see, I've just pulled this really easily up. You know, you can kind of pull that away quite easily, whereas up here it's bonded fairly well in comparison. And it just seems to be that over time the heat just gets into it and it lifts it. Now, that may be accentuated by some kind of shuffle, if there's any kind of movement in there, which I think there was a claim that the plastic dowels, which I believe sit in these areas, made the head in the block shuffle a little bit, which again, if you imagine you get a little bit of movement here, it's going to prise it away. I'm not sure about that. There's others out there probably more knowledgeable than me. They'll say, yeah, that is the reason, but whatever it is, the heat seems to get into this design and it fails. So on my car, that's what happened, and I got a mobile mechanic, MG Rover Solutions, to do that. Anyway, there is a new design, which is a multi-layer steel gasket. Does away with this completely. Does away with this type of design. And you have a series of sheets of steel on there, and I think there is some kind of elastomer in there. I'm not 100% sure, but to be honest, it seems to do the trick. As long as everything's okay, you haven't cooked the head and made it soft, you haven't got any liners out of sync, it does the trick. And I've had one of them fitted in my MGF for, it's been 9 years now, never used a drop of water. Just had that fitted in my Rover Coupe, so hopefully all will be well. And you know, that design I believe was taken forward by MG Motors, who's now owned by the Chinese, and they don't seem to have had any problems. And I don't think there's been many problems with the multi-layer steel gasket, except one thing: there's different ones out there, and some of them are absolutely rubbish, and basically eBay rubbish. So make sure you get a really good make, a decent make put on there. Otherwise, don't blame the engine, blame the bloody gasket, because there's some crap, like a lot of things. There's a lot of crap out there which are dressed up as engine components, and they're not very good. So as long as you get a good one, you shouldn't really get any problems. But that's just a video to show this, because you know, a lot of people are just talking about it without actually looking at the problem and the component that fails, and giving their own opinion. But you can see quite clearly that how it's degrading. You've only got this elastomer bead really that it's getting clamped down on there, and that has to seal everything. That has to seal it. It has to seal the water, it has to seal the oil, stop them crossing over into each other, and it has to seal everything from the outside world as well. So you can see if there is a problem in this design, it's gonna come, you know, if you get a problem, it's gonna raise its ugly head quite quickly, I imagine. If part of this fails like it did with me, after one run up to Stansted, I noticed that the water had disappeared, and then I saw some oil glooping back up in the water. So I thought, right, that's it. I'm not driving this till it's done. But there you go. Hopefully that's useful. And all I'll say is, do not fear the K series from Rover. It's a good engine. As long as you look after it, it's as good as anything else. Very economical, nice and smooth, and rev happy.